If there is one film trend that will seemingly never die out, it is the slasher. Slasher film is defined as a subgenre of horror films involving a killer murdering a group of people, usually by use of bladed tools. Often notable for cheap budgets, endless amounts of sequels, and lots of gore, the slasher can attribute its success to three revolutionary films that kept the formulaic subgenre fresh with each decade. The slasher's roots stretch all the way back to the 1930s when B-movie directors adapted Madman on the Loose type novels by authors such as Agatha Christie to the screen. Films like these were made up through the 1950s and were notably tamed for films in the horror genre due to the production code. Created in 1934, the Motion Picture Production Code was created to censor Hollywood productions from including inappropriate content in their films. The rules were enacted to emphasize good taste and end vulgarity and suggestiveness in cinema. All of this changed with the release of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Released in 1960, Psycho was the first real slasher and a game changer for the film industry. It included several elements which were considered unacceptable for film, such as its emphasis on violence and sexuality, as well as being the first film to ever show a toilet flushing. Psycho established many precedents for slashers to come and shattered the production code. The film's protagonist was engaging in premarital sex and embezzling money, creating an image of an immoral character who must die, and all those thereafter to wander off alone were in grave danger. The way the film handled its antagonist was also groundbreaking, as Norman Bates was an empathetic character manifesting serial killer tendencies from past psychological trauma. The iconic shower scene showing a woman attacked at her most vulnerable was like nothing anybody had ever seen before. Psycho was a huge commercial and critical success, and nominated for 4 Oscars, including Perkins' performance as Norman Bates. Film directors and actors alike recognized the potential of this type of film, and thus the subgenre was born. The next decade and a half saw many cheap exploitation films find similar success in pop-up venues such as drive-ins and newly developed grindhouses. Grindhouses were theaters showing strictly explicit films, whether through graphic violence or sexuality. Films such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre found their success here. It was at the end of the 1970s where the second most important film to influence the subgenre was released, Halloween. Released in 1978, Halloween was created on a low budget from horror filmmaker John Carpenter and was considered one of the scariest movies ever made shortly after its release. Carpenter was influenced by Hitchcock in his casting of Jamie Lee Curtis, daughter of Janet Leigh, and naming one of his characters Sam Loomis after a character in Psycho. Halloween re-established the tropes of the genre and revolutionized the slasher forever. Its protagonist was the virtuous girl amongst her sexually active friends, and thus she is allowed to live while the others die. The film also established the final girl trope. This is the last person alive to confront the killer, and is usually a girl. The POV shots of the killer stalking their prey was used to chilling effect and became another recurring trend in horror. Michael Myers became an instantly recognizable villain in film history. What made this monster so frightening was the fear of the unknown. The silent masked killer had very little character and was portrayed as the embodiment of evil. With so few traits to his person, the audience could pour their own fears into the mysterious killer. Made for just north of $300,000, Halloween made back 70 times its budget and brought the slasher into the blockbuster mainstream. Between 1978 and 1984, over 100 similar slasher films were made in a rush to replicate the success of Carpenter's hit. The subgenre became focused on franchising and making an iconic, frightening killer to lead the series. Halloween received its first sequel in 1981, and the series now holds 10 films with an 11th on the way next year. Friday the 13th was the next big slasher series, released in 1980. Jason's memorable hockey mask and machete connected with mainstream audiences and followed Halloween's silent killer strategy. Pushing further into the supernatural horror realm was Wes Craven's 1984 hit, A Nightmare on Elm Street. This film saw its iconic killer, Freddy Krueger, killing his victims in their dreams. In 1988, Child's Play turned a kid-friendly object into an object of terror with Chucky. These 3 franchises alone have collectively produced 24 sequels, and all saw their last installment in the past decade, proving their lasting ability in the marketplace. But after a tired formula was nearly worn out by the endless amounts of cheap and poorly made sequels, a change was needed. Craven returned to the subgenre of slasher to revive it once more with the third most influential film in the subgenre's history, 1996's Scream. The hook of Scream was, what if the characters in a slasher knew they were in a slasher? What if the rules of who lives and who dies were known by the characters in the film? And what if they were fans of slashers like Halloween themselves, which plays on a TV during some of the final moments of the film? A subgenre which had seemingly run its course was now operating on a new whole level of self-awareness that added a fascinating dimension to the story. Chocked full of horror references and creating a new, recognizable killer, Scream was a huge success, spawning 4 sequels of its own. Scary Movie followed this pattern of success by parodying the parody, going an extra step in the meta fourth wall breaking humor. And of course, this became its own franchise as well. At the end of this video, I'll show you my own spin on the subgenre with a parody horror trailer I made for a non-existent third sequel in a non-existent slasher film franchise. So where does the slasher stand today? Studios have tried every combination of their familiar slasher villains, with Freddy vs. Jason and reboots and remakes of these classics, such as Friday the 13th in 2009, A Nightmare on Elm Street in 2010, and most recently Halloween in 2018. These films prove that the properties are still profitable today. The slasher still exists because the low budgets with which they are made are easily earned back in box office revenue and home video sales. One would think that since its inception with Psycho, way back in 1960, that the slasher would have died out by now. But the subgenre has been able to adapt and reinvent itself with films such as the original Halloween and Scream in ways that make it a goldmine for studios and fresh for audiences who have seen this story 100 times before.